It's The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. I'm Nadia Massi in this Friday for Francois Picard. And joining me to dissect our top stories of the week is our panel of 4 journalists. Joining us from London, Agnes Poirier, correspondent at Express. Also in London, Nico Hines, world editor at The Daily Beast. Welcome to you both.
Good evening.
And in the studio with me here in Paris, Fabrice Rousselot, news editor at The Conversation. Welcome to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And veteran of this programme, Vivian Walt, correspondent for Time Magazine, is with me as well.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good to have you all with us tonight. Let's start then with the first EU summit inside Ukraine in wartime. Led by Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, it is a trip steeped in symbolism as the one-year anniversary of the Russian invasion ticks closer. The European leaders determined then to show their support for Zelensky's government, but no surprise that Ukraine is seeking something more. Fast-tracked membership of the EU, for one thing. Zelensky today said he wants to start those negotiations to join the EU this year.
Today's summit was an opportunity for us to show that Ukraine is making sound progress towards reaching criteria for Europe's single market. We've put in place a number of actions which will enable Ukraine to become a fully fledged member of the European Union.
It is, though, a goal that may be rather far off for Ukraine. Let's have a listen to Charles Michel speaking to France 24 from Kyiv.
I think we have to support Ukraine for as long as we can. We feel there's a strong political will to implement the necessary reforms. Look at what has happened in the few months since Ukraine got candidate status. It was last June. Great strides have been made in strengthening the rule of law, the fight against corruption, independence of the judiciary. There's still some way to go, of course, but we'll be with Ukraine all the way to support their wish to come into the European Union.
So, Fabrice Rousseau, let's start the programme with you if we can. Charles Michel saying there is still some way to go to Ukraine joining the European Union. Reading between the lines, what do you think he meant?
He meant that it's going to happen now, and he meant that nothing is going to start really this year. I mean, one of the issues for Europe is basically the entry of Ukraine or the candidacy even is a complicated one. When they set up in June, back in June this year, was to basically have some conditions. One of them was about corruption. So we saw all of a sudden an action in the past few days about corrupted or potentially corrupted millionaires and Ukrainian people there. But there are many other issues. I mean, France, for example, for the moment, is not really ready to have Ukraine enter the European Union, even candidacy, for example, just because of the weight of Ukraine in terms of agriculture, which is another issue that nobody mentions, but it's very in the mind of French politicians.
Indeed, and let's get the view on that from Agnes Poirier, who joins us now from London. Agnes, Emmanuel Macron said it might take 10 years before Ukraine could join the European Union. Do you think he's right?
Well, we don't know because the war is...
Agnes Poirier, are you still with us? Unfortunately, I think we lost her, but not to worry. Let's ask Vivian Walt, who's with me here in the studio. What do you think? Is this a long way off EU membership for Ukraine?
I think actually what Macron said was decades rather than 1 decade. And you have Zelensky on the other side saying he wants it in 2 years. That's obviously, not going to happen. Yeah. No way.
Yeah.
And I think that, as Fabrice was saying, there's a whole range of issues. It's not just corruption, but you're trying to unravel and kind of reconstitute a way of governing that's basically been going on for 30 years. And that's, where the oligarchs have had tremendous power, other than very recently. And there's really no sign yet that that Ukraine is going to emerge from the war as a kind of transparent Western country. The odds are not great.
We'll come to the corruption in a moment, but first of all, just on the war itself, Nico Hines, I mean, the war has to end first before Ukraine can join the European Union, surely, and there is no roadmap for that at the moment, is there?
That's a very good point. I think Zelensky has been, masterful in the way he has made these demands from the West. It seems as though, and I'm sure this isn't the case, he's obviously spending a huge amount of time looking at what's happening on the battlefield and the war itself. But it seems like he spends all day, every day, coming up with brilliant ways to convince politicians in the West and the public in the West that certain things are needed. Every time he demands something, the West says no, first of all, and then eventually sort of succumbs to his wishes. I think full EU membership is something that he can't magic up over a short period of time, because as you've seen with Brexit and the way Britain has to be so carefully entwined, it's not just a question of, do we want this country in our club? It's a question of, do we have full regulatory alignment? Do we have the same rules for finances, the same rules for our economy? It's a kind of incredibly complex whole set of mechanisms to get you on the same page. So that can't be rushed. But I do think that the only reason they've been allowed to become a candidacy country so quickly is because of the war. And once again, Zelensky has made the very best of that. Perhaps what we should really be focusing on is getting Ukraine into NATO, as that, as a military alliance, is much more useful in the most obvious ways, and that the military backup is really what Ukraine needs right now. But I think Zelensky's done a brilliant job of making sure that he's in the forefront of everyone's minds in Europe.
I'm being told Agnes Poirier has rejoined us now from London. Agnes, what about that idea then of Ukraine joining NATO first? Russia certainly would have a lot to say about that.
No, I agree. I mean, it's we can talk about accession of, the EU as a full member, but I think it will take a sort of deepening and gradual integration. And there are so many different ways of going about it, and becoming a NATO member or affiliate would certainly be one thing. But on the whole, if I can go back to what I was saying before we were cut off, I think it will prove quicker for Ukraine just because of the war. If you look at the supplies of sophisticated weapons, I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment. A few months ago, we all said no way we'll send tanks, and now they're on their way. And we're saying the same about fighter jets. But I can grant you, in a few months' time, fighter jets will be on their way to Ukraine.
Fighter jets will be on their way to Ukraine in a few weeks. Quite the statement. Would you agree, Vivian Wald?
I'm not quite sure. I'm not as sure as Agnes is. I mean, just because the amount of training to train fighter pilots is, tremendously long and complicated and expensive and intensive. And the chances of things going horribly wrong are quite great. I mean, I would say on the EU question that it seems like Zelensky's been using this kind of message, which I'm not sure is that wise an idea, of being almost a message of like, you owe us. We've done this for you, and now you owe us EU membership. And I don't think the EU sees that at all. I think that in some ways they are talking two different languages. And I think the missing piece in all of this is, what is the end game here? And nobody seems to actually be articulating it. Nobody is actually, as far as I can see, envisioning a sort of exit route out of this war.
That certainly does seem to be true for the moment. I mean, listening to all of that, Fabrice, would you agree that we are, these conversations about joining the European Union are almost a bit hypothetical right now? Ukraine is in the middle of this war, and it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon.
I think actually both sides know it's not going to happen. Zelensky knows it's not going to happen. But what he needs to sort those images. He needs to see Ursula von der Leyen in Kyiv, talking to him, supporting him. This is as much as a communication war than anything else. In terms of the candidacy, it's going to take as long as it's needed, which might be 10 years, 15 years, and he knows it's not going to happen. But as I said, this communication tool of whatever he's saying doesn't really matter. What he needs, he's showing Putin that Europe is behind him, and he's going to Kyiv. This is an historical summit. It never happened before. So he's showing that to Putin, and for him, it's as important as anything else.
Indeed, and there may well be reticence right now about allowing Ukraine into the European Union, but other Ukrainian demands, once seen as impossible, are now on the table. We already heard it mentioned there, fighter jets. Poland and the Netherlands do appear increasingly willing to supply them. And here's what the French defence minister had to say about the idea just earlier this week.
Our doctrine is clear, there is no taboo. And so the minister came with part of his general staff to detail the needs of the Ukrainian military, of which aviation is a part.
Nico Hines, maybe I can bring you in on that then. Were you surprised by that kind of language from the French? There is no taboo, said the French defence minister on that idea of fighter jets. Do you agree with Agnes that this is inevitable now?
I think it does seem like that will be the case. It seems to have been the case in every other instance, as we've mentioned. I think there's something very interesting going on in Washington, where Joe Biden was asked if F-16s were on the table, and he gave a one-word answer, no. And then immediately, the Washington Post ran a story this week that had several senior officials at the Pentagon saying, it's very frustrating that the White House keeps saying no when we know that these are the things that are required. We know that this will probably eventually happen, and we know that strategically this is what we need. It seems very clear to military strategists that the quickest way of getting this war over with is to basically give Ukraine everything that it's asking for on the battlefield. I'm sure they're asking for things that are being advised by Western governments as well, by Western militaries as well. So they're not just going by what the Ukrainian armed forces think, but the Western strategists and the Ukrainian strategists are coming up with a way to win this war. And that, you know, we talked about what's the exit strategy. The exit strategy for Kyiv, and the exit strategy that would be most simple of all, is to drive Russia out of all of their claimed lands in the Donbass and the eastern regions and out of Crimea, and then return to the pre-2014 borders. And that would be the simplest end to this war. Let's hope that that can happen.
Not just to survive then for Ukraine, to win the war. That's what Nico Hines thinks in London. On that, a question to you all. I mean, we've heard just this evening, within the last hour or so, that the United States is now going to supply $2 billion worth of long-range missiles to the Ukrainian army. That would help them push beyond the Russian lines in the east of the country. So do you think that is now what we're talking about? Not simply a return to the start of the war, but pushing Russia even further back, perhaps even out of Crimea as well. Vivian, what do you think? I mean, it sounds extreme, doesn't it, at this stage?
It has to happen.
It has to happen.
I mean, I would agree with Nico. It has to happen because the Ukrainians will not have come this far and not want to make a very strong fight for Crimea. It's hugely symbolic to them. And it's not like this war began a year ago. It actually did begin nearly 9 years ago. And the Ukrainians are very well aware of what they've lost. And having come this far, I personally do not see it ending without a fight for Crimea.
So do you think then this war will drag on for many more years? Is that what we're really looking at here, if those are the new lines that Ukraine wants to sketch out for itself? I
think it's a difficult situation. I mean, you can think that it should happen. I'm not sure it's going to happen, and I'm not sure how long it's going to take for it to happen. If you look at the French, for example, politicians, there are already people screaming in the National Assembly about, let's have a big discussion about what are we doing with Ukraine? How far can we go? What is the limit? Where are we going to put a limit to what's happening? And you can support the fact that, of course, we need to help as much as possible. But then French politics might enter it and say, and Macron has had a very kind of a dubious position. He started to be very, very cautious on the tank. Okay, we're going to have some tanks, some lighting. And he said, we'll see, nothing is taboo. Before we see French fighters, for example, airplanes in Ukraine, I think it's going to take some time. And what's bothering Macron, and as you know, he's one of the few still talking to Putin, nobody knows what's going on the other side. Nobody knows what's Putin's state of mind, what he's going to react to. Remember those drawings a few months back where they were showing missiles, going to London and Paris. I'm not saying it's going to happen. What I'm saying is, at the moment, I think nobody, in Europe knows what's in Putin's mind and where he's ready to go or not ready to go. And the mobilization, for example, that he's been announcing for a few weeks now. If this happens, and I'm not sure it can happen, but those are questions that everybody's asking themselves. And so I would be a bit more cautious. I agree that we should, but are we going to? I'm not sure.
Well, you say you don't know how Putin will react to this. I mean, a little bit earlier on this week, it was yesterday actually, Vladimir Putin spoke marking the 80th anniversary of Stalingrad. I hope we have a soundbite of that we might be able to listen to.
Those who expect to defeat Russia on the battlefield do not seem to understand that a modern war with Russia would be very different to World War II. We have not sent our tanks to their border, but we have something to answer with. And the use of armoured vehicles will not be the end of it. Everyone should understand this.
And Agnes Poirier, Vladimir Putin, they're saying, we have not sent our tanks. It almost sounds like he wants to say, yet. It's a threat, isn't it, to the West? And as we talk about more and more weapons going to Ukraine, fighter jets, as you say, there are questions now about the Russian response, surely.
Well, as Fabrice said earlier, I mean, the thing is, we don't know what's going on in Moscow. And in the head of Putin, and we will never know. What we know, though, is that Putin and his clique are obsessed with dates and anniversaries, and this is something Ukraine knows very well. That's why there are fears of an offensive, a ground offensive, perhaps at the end of February the 24th would be a date, an anniversary. And we also know that there are a lot of newly mobilized recruits, hundreds of thousands at the border. And we also know that there's this moment when the winter ground frost turns into that thick mud, and they want to do the offensive before Western tanks reach the battlefield. And this is why it's such a delicate balance. This is why I said we will eventually provide fighter jets, as we did with Patriots, the US did with Patriots, or with even longer strike range missiles that the US is about to deliver as well. So there is an escalation. Of course, we have to be cautious, but it's, when we talked about what is the exit strategy, well, it's the victory of Ukraine. That's what we're all gearing up to. It would be good to have, other plans just in case that doesn't work. But that's probably what all the diplomats are working on at the present. But we know we need to supply on time Ukraine with the sophisticated weaponry it will need to actually win on the battlefield.
Well, speaking of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, one aspect we haven't discussed yet is the use of drones, many of them Iranian. And that is something the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, would like us to be talking about. Now, he met President Macron in Paris yesterday. He met the US Secretary of State earlier on this week. In both cases, his focus was clear. Not the unrest in his country, but the common enemy, he said, of Iran.
I'm leaving now for a meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron. The main issue that will be at the center of our discussion is, of course, Iran and the joint efforts to fight its aggression and its push to obtain nuclear weapons.
And Fabrice Rousselot, what do you think Netanyahu is trying to achieve here in Paris?
He's trying to achieve what he's been trying to achieve for a few years now, which is basically trying to stop whatever is happening in Iran regarding to nuclear weapons. And one way to achieve that is obviously Iran was drawn into the Ukrainian conflict, so he thinks he's going to make allies, and he's pushing the issue with the French and with the Americans. At the same time, he's in a very delicate position. As you said, at home, I think, honestly, it's one of the worst contexts we've ever seen in the region in decades for many different reasons. On international level, because there is a disengagement that's been happening for quite a long time. On a national level, because of the radicalization on both sides. And on the local level, was it even fragmentation inside the Israeli government, but also among the Palestinian different factions. So all of this make it quite difficult for him to push for his issue. At the same time, France and Europe are still waiting for America to officially stop those those negotiations that were stopped with President Trump. But
the JCPOA.
Exactly, they are still waiting. Once that is done, then I guess he has some leverage there that he can use and try to push for basically having the West stop this escalation in terms of nuclear weapons in Iran.
Nico Hines, what do you think of that? Is this trip to France partly about establishing an anti-Iran alliance, using that issue of drones to connect what's happening in Ukraine to something that he has talked about for a very long time?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what he's trying to do. It seems somewhat far-fetched and a bit fanciful that, the US and Paris are going to fall into line just because Iran has sold some drones to Russia. Like, that's true. And it's also true that there are kind of bigger fears of Iran, especially in Washington, D.C., which has always had an outsized kind of fear of Tehran that we don't really share in Europe. So Netanyahu is right in the sense that policymakers in the White House and in the Pentagon care more deeply about Iran than they do about the plight of the Palestinian people. And so it's great for him to pump up those issues. But in terms of whether that's going to blind everybody to the big, huge problems that are going on in Israel at the moment, I don't think it will. And, Macron's words, which have leaked out of their bilateral meeting from last night, saying that basically Israel's at the verge of fracturing its relationship with what the rest of us consider democracy, it's very strong talk. And it's very obvious that Blinken made some slightly milder but similar remarks when he was over there visiting. So it's very obvious that the rest of the world has noticed what's going on in Israel, despite how much Bibi Netanyahu wants us to look the other way and just focus on Iran.
Vivian, you've been nodding. You agree then? Netanyahu is trying to play the Iran card. It's not working very well.
But I mean, here we are with the most intractable conflict maybe in the world. I mean, this has been going on for 60 years. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of way out. There doesn't, certainly on the ground, you have Netanyahu, who's now got perhaps the most right-wing government that Israel has had in generations. And he has no motivation to be negotiating with Blinken on the ground about settlements and all the issues that might diffuse things. And so all that, Blinken is left with is to go to the Palestinians and say to Mahmoud Abbas, please, you have to kind of get a grip on your people, which, of course, he does not have a grip on. I mean, you have these, as Nico says, you have these hardcore groups emerging from the situation, and Jenin and Nablus, new groups who are harder line and maybe better organized, maybe better armed than before. So I think that, for both Europe and the US, what's happening on the ground, sadly, is a little bit of a sideshow to a much bigger issue, which is Iran.
So on Iran, then, do you agree with what Nico Hines just said, that actually this probably isn't going to work from Netanyahu trying to sort of link the issues of Ukraine and Iran? Or do you think actually that's a rather effective technique? Perhaps both of you could answer that.
Well, I mean, look, obviously, in some ways, yes, they have a common enemy in Iran. Of course, the US has a whole range of issues with Iran, going beyond, their threats to Israel. But it's very difficult actually to see even a return to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal at this point, with the Iranian government, hanging protesters. Unless I'm missing something, I just don't see how this is going to happen.
No, I agree. And I think for Macron, is not going to engage with Israel and Iran unless something happens, on the ground in terms of what's happening on the ground in terms of justice reform, the whole battle with the Supreme Court, what's happening with the far right pushing, Netanyahu in his, retrenchments about, colonies and so on. I mean, there was a sentence that was used by a French politician, somebody around Macron, and put in the French press recently. They said they were commenting on the new government, and they said, Netanyahu is actually the only adult in the room, meaning that far-right coalition with ultra-Orthodox are not even considered by French politicians as people to talk to. Indeed,
I mean, it's worth emphasising that his security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, was considered too extreme as a young man to join the Israeli Defence Forces, and now he holds one of the most important posts in the country. Agnes Poirier, from where you stand in London, how do you see all of this unfolding at the moment? Antony Blinken this week was talking about the two-state solution. We've heard that kind of language many times before, but it doesn't really seem like it's going anywhere, does it?
No, I mean, it seems that the situation is highly volatile because you have two leaders, one in Israel, Netanyahu, who is very keen to stay in power, but he is at the helm of probably the most extreme right government in Israel history, and of course he's got problem with many trials concerning him and corruption affairs, and then of course in Iran. You've got an 83-year-old leader, Khamenei, who would very much want to forget about the challenges at home to his rule, and also there's the succession. And the Palestinians can be used by Iran simply because Iran would like to appear as the sole defender of the Palestinian cause. Israel is in a bad position because what about its new Arab allies that are in a very uncomfortable position? And of course, the West is quite preoccupied by still fears, of a global recession and of course the war in Ukraine. So this is highly volatile. And we might be, when I say we, the West might be caught unaware of suddenly a new intifada or something like this.
A new intifada, that's certainly a question. I want to move on to one of our other topics in a moment, but let me just quickly bring in Nico Hines on that. I mean, there are some analysts who say it's not just a question of whether or not there will be a third intifada, Nico, but rather, given the scale of violence in the West Bank over the past year and in the last month in Israel, whether it's actually already begun.
Yeah, that would probably be one way to look at it. I think what we're going to get soon, as kind of comes round in clockwork in Israeli politics, is another election, because I just can't see this government holding out for much longer. This battle, you've got the Israeli Attorney General herself coming out criticising what Netanyahu's trying to do. You've got the French, the Americans criticising what he's trying to do. You've got huge protests on the streets, and already basically the population has lost support for Netanyahu's rag-bag, crazy right-wing coalition. There's no doubt it's only a matter of time before one of these major players in the coalition comes out with something that's so crazy, so radical, that even Netanyahu can't get on board with it, and there's going to be another falling out. So I think before we get into a huge new wars type scenario, what's going to happen is there's going to be another fracturing of Israeli politics, and heaven help us, another Israeli election.
Well, that is a bleak thought. Nico Hines, thank you for that. So that was Antony Blinken, who was in Israel earlier this week, and he was due to head to China shortly, but he's actually cancelled that trip today after a Chinese spy balloon was discovered flying across the United States. Now, China has issued a statement on this. It says the balloon was being used for meteorological research and had actually been blown off course by bad weather. There has, though, within the last hour or so, been a statement from the Pentagon. They've described it as a surveillance object from the People's Republic of China. Take a listen.
We are aware of the PRC's statement. However, the fact is we know that it's a surveillance balloon. We do know that the balloon has violated U.S. airspace and international law, which is unacceptable. And so we've conveyed this directly to the PRC at multiple levels. And
Vivian Walt, this story sort of broke as we came on air about an hour and a half ago. I mean, what do you make of it?
Crazy, although maybe not so crazy. Firstly, they have flown such surveillance balloons over Taiwan, for example, and Taiwan is, of course, a major issue now. You had, the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, going to visit Taiwan. You had, there's increasingly a sort of sense that the U.S. is opening up to Taiwan, and as it's sort of shutting its or turning its back on China, shall we say. For the world economy, obviously, it's an extremely dangerous prospect to have the decoupling of the two major economies in the world. Just to look at it through economic terms, there is such a fierce sort of competition between the two that I think it's kind of going to dominate the next several years.
Yeah, well, certainly the next few hours in the United States, because in that Pentagon briefing, they told Americans if they were in certain parts of the country, they could look up and see it in the sky, even though it is 60,000 meters up there. I mean, that is quite remarkable, Fabrice. But the Americans also saying, look, we can't shoot this down for the moment because there's a risk that the debris could actually injure somebody. Have you ever in your time as a journalist heard of a story like this?
No, that's the right answer. And it's a fascinating story because I can understand, and they have been doing that over Taiwan. This is the United States. How did it get there? Was it lost or from where?
Balloon, of course.
Yeah, of course. And it's going east, so it's crossing over, which is quite fascinating as well. So either it's a huge mistake, either it's something intentional and they tried something but I can't believe it's just like out of nowhere, this balloon. Taiwan, yeah, okay, but the US. So, and the thing is, the fact that the US is telling everybody, please don't do anything with it. We can't do anything with it because we are basically scared that some debris are going to fall. It's also kind of it's a laughing matter almost. And if and I think knowing a bit of the U.S. media, that's going to be the story for the next 2 or 3 days, and they're going to make a big thing out of it. But I don't expect any kind of reasonable answer from China. They gave their answer already, saying sorry, that was for weather purposes. I don't believe that 1 second.
Nico Hines, just briefly on this, is it the lead story on the Daily Beast today?
Our readers actually aren't really buying it. But I think what's interesting is that there doesn't seem to be any real military or espionage reason to use a balloon like this. Most of the intelligence you could gather with one could have been gleaned with satellites, which obviously the Chinese have already got up there and are well aware of whatever it is that this balloon can see because they've got great coverage all across the world. So it seems to me as though they've put this balloon up there as a little reminder to the rest of the world that China's still around. Don't get too focused on Ukraine and Iran and everything that's going on in Russia. China are still here. China are the big boys, and they'll do whatever they want.
All right, let's pivot now to our last topic and one far closer to earth. Strikes and protests on both sides of the English Channel in the United Kingdom and in France. Now, the ones in the UK were the largest in a decade. They were over pay and working conditions. While the ones here in France, of course, were all about the government's deeply unpopular pension reforms.
You are wearing people down. You are sapping all of our energy, and now there is nothing left in the tank. And when people have nothing left, that's when the anger becomes strongest.
And Fabrice, when you compare France to other European countries, in terms of its retirement age, it's actually doing not too bad at all. I believe it has one of the lowest in Europe, even if it gets risen to 64, which is what this government wants to do. So can you give us a sense as to why there is such anger, such depth of feeling about this?
Are you saying that French people like strikes?
I am aware of that.
It's something. I mean, if you compare, for example, with the UK, which I think is interesting, because in the UK it's the background is the same. There's some elements of the background that are the same: inflation, cost of living, a lot of this. But you can't compare those two movements. In the UK, it's a sector movement. It's also the way Margaret Thatcher reformed the unions and everything else. So it comes from from the base. In France, it's not that. This is about the French idea of the welfare state. If you look back 50 years, pension reforms has always led to demonstrations. Only one actually worked. The mobilization worked in 1995. It was part of a bigger, law about social security, but there was something about pension reform in there. What French people are basically saying, they are saying, you know what? It's interesting. They are saying we agree that we need a pension reform. What we don't agree with is for workers to pay the price for it. And this morning there was a new survey coming out, and they basically 70% of French people said, what we want to see more taxes, not for them, but more taxes for big companies, making those huge profits, more taxing for the rich to pay for that reform. And they want to keep this, what we call système de répartition, which is a sharing system where, as you know, we all French people contribute to that system, so we can pay. I pay for my neighbor, and he pays for me, and so on and so on and so on. They want to keep that, but not to the extent of working way more. And even if you look at the average in Europe, we are one of the lowest in terms of working hours in Europe and working age, but still they don't want to. It's been like the fifth one in 40 years. So they're a bit tired as well. If you add to that what I said earlier, which is the context of, low cost of living being, more and more difficult, big inflation, the fact people came out of COVID, the fact people came out of Gilets jaunes, and Macron being, not so popular with a lot of, some of the population, and you add all of this up and you get, what we have in the street, and it's going to go on for some time.
It is indeed. There are more strikes and protests, I believe, planned for next Tuesday. Well, let's do a bit more of a comparison then between what is happening here in France and, as Fabrice alluded to there, Britain. Teachers, 500,000 of them in the UK, went on strike on Thursday. Let's have a listen to some of their reasons for doing that.
The pay that we're receiving just does not align with the work that we're doing, the hours that we put in, and inflation at the moment and this cost of living crisis. And so we're striking because we have to make our point that enough is enough.
It costs me money, but I don't care if it costs me £1,000, because to my mind, nobody, the working man, the nurses, the teachers, the doctors, the train drivers, the train unions, everybody deserves more money.
It's quite depressing, it's quite scary. It doesn't really feel like anything's going to change. I don't know, it feels like the demise of the UK.
And Agnes Poirier, you are a French woman who lives in the United Kingdom. You're the perfect person to answer this question for me, I think. The strike culture in the UK is different, isn't it, to here? Why do you think that is?
Well, in the UK, you don't strike, and in France, you strike. In the sense that taking to the streets is a very French way of going about democracy, whereas democracy is done in the UK in Parliament. So it's quite rare to take to the streets, which is very much a French concept. And the reason why the British are taking to the streets, or rather protest. And it's been going on actually since June. I mean, now if you watch British TV, there's a sort of banner, and not telling you about the weather forecast, but just telling you what you can expect every day, who is on strike today. And I've just received, the diary for next week, and so every day you've got a university, teachers, nurses, and by the way, nurses are on strike for the first time in their history. And you've got ambulance drivers, etc. So a lot of people don't want to actually fall sick or break their leg at home because they know they will be in a lot of trouble. So it's a combination of things. There's inflation, of course, which is at the double of inflation in France, for instance. There's also COVID fatigue, certainly for anyone working on the NHS, nurses, doctors, etc. A lack of public investment in all the state sector. And there's Brexit. Brexit is very much behind a lot of what's going badly in terms of, in economic terms. And there's also a sort of, it's very strange, but it's the end of the Tory rule. The Conservatives have been in power for 12 years. We've known 5 different prime ministers in 6 years. And it's the end of an era, if you like, and Labour is very much preparing for next year's election. So, it's a combination of things. But of course,
indeed. And one of those things you mentioned there, forgive me
prices.
for cutting across you, Agnes, we're running slightly out of time, and I did very much tease this Brexit section, so I'm going to see if we can get into it a little bit if we can. You mentioned Brexit there because this is the 3-year anniversary of the UK leaving the European Union. And Nico Hines, perhaps I can bring you in on that as you're also in the UK. I read today a new portmanteau. Instead of Brexit, apparently there's now regret in the United Kingdom. Do you recognise that? Are people regretting Brexit where you are?
I think in a word, yes. Obviously, it's a very complex question. Some people still hold very dear to the vote, and they love that they voted for Brexit, and they think that the things that have gone wrong since are either mere coincidences or because Brexit hasn't been implemented fully and viciously enough. But I think if you look at the country overall, it's very, very clear that the country, if it was asked to vote again, would vote in a different way. We're looking at something like, it's not quite, but it's almost 60% of the country now thinks we'd be better off in the EU, and 40% thinks they'd be better off out of it. So it's no longer close. Part of that is people changing their minds because the economy is so bad, inflation is so bad. If you look at the IMF warnings, it's saying that Britain over the next year is going to be the only major industrialized nation with negative growth. So there's no way to kind of sugarcoat it. Britain is doing uniquely badly at the moment.
Indeed, and we can actually show you our viewers that report now, that graphic now, rather. Forgive me for cutting across you as well, but that does show the UK being the only country having negative growth according to those IMF projections, and that does also include Russia. I mean, that is remarkable, isn't it, Vivian?
Yes, indeed. It is doing worse than Russia. Well, it's
forecast
Russia's a bigger oil power still. But, what's interesting to me is that what Nico says, this tremendous wave of regret. And the Brits keep saying, well, next election, the Labour's saying next election we'll put Brexit, rejoining the EU back on the table, etc. And I just wonder whether the EU is kind of that ready to welcome them back.
Yeah. Well, we saw how hard it is for Ukraine to get in,
It's, and what happens the next time there's a Brexit referendum? So it doesn't seem to, at least from the British point of view, maybe the two Londoners can disagree with this, but it just doesn't seem like anyone's actually stopped to think, we might want to go back, but actually the EU might have closed the door.
You'd agree with that, I imagine, Fabrice Rousseau, that France, for example, is in no hurry to let Britain back in, should it even want to?
Let's put it that way. France is going to take its time because, Brexit was really a shock, among Europe. And coming back to what Nikos was saying, you have a lot of studies showing, independent economists, showing that basically what's happening in the UK today in terms of economy, this inflation being so high, shortage of labor, imports being way more expensive, exports being way less than they used to be. All of this is due to Brexit. So true, that's going to, and some people said it from the beginning, you're going to see the impact. I have a lot of friends in London that are regretting, and they just,
Are they thinking of coming back to France?
Well, no. What they are saying is some French people came back to France and came back to France, but some British friends are also saying we made a mistake. And we made a mistake, and we know it now. And if we had to choose, we would go back, we'd join back. And I keep telling them, yeah, you're going to have to wait a little bit.
Absolutely. Maybe a long wait for Ukraine and perhaps an even longer wait for the United Kingdom. That is it for The World this week, this Friday. I want to thank all of my guests very much indeed. Agnes Poirier joining us from London, Nico Hines as well in London, Fabrice Rousselot with me in the studio, and Vivian Walt as well. It's been a real pleasure to have you all. Thanks to you for watching the France 24 The World this week. And do stay with us. The World News resumes shortly with a colleague of mine.